I'd like to thank the organizers of the annual Welsh Tenants Conference for allowing me to participate. It's fantastic that we can use technology to get me to your very important meeting. I'm Leilani Farha. I'm the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing. I was appointed by the UN Human Rights Council, which is pretty much the highest human rights body within the UN system. And I was only recently appointed about 2 months ago, actually in May of this year. For those of you who don't know what a UN Special Rapporteur is, let me give you just a brief description. Rapporteurs, well, in my case, I'm the rapporteur for the right to adequate housing. So really, my job is to monitor the right to adequate housing globally. And this involves a whole variety of activities. It includes doing country missions. It includes receiving communications about violations or possible violations of the right to adequate housing from around the world. I do awareness raising, I attend conferences like this, and I write thematic reports. So I have to report to the UN periodically, and I will do so on different thematic areas as my mandate unfolds. The mandate runs for 3 years and is generally renewed for another 3 years. Let me also tell you just a little bit about myself, my background. I am a human rights lawyer, and I've worked for about 20 years on the right to adequate housing at both the international level and domestically. I think I have a pretty good understanding of some of the issues that you're interested in at this conference. So let me begin by just providing you with a very short, succinct overview of what the right to adequate housing means and where you can find it. Many international human rights treaties that the United Kingdom has ratified include reference to the right to adequate housing as a human right. The most important articulation is in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights under Article 11.1, which says everyone has the right to an adequate standard of living, including adequate food and housing. And so that is the primary or chief articulation, but you'll find this right in other treaties, treaties pertaining to women, to children, to racial discrimination, to people with disabilities. The meaning or the understanding of the right to adequate housing goes well beyond the concept of just, 4 walls and a roof. It's understood that housing is so central to one's dignity and to living a full and complete life. There are also a number of sort of characteristics that we might say are required for adequate housing. The chief one being, and this will be important for you to consider during your conference, the chief characteristic is the security of tenure. In other words, your ability to stay in a home and not feel threatened and not feel like you may be evicted or you may lose that home for whatever reason. But there are other characteristics as well. Housing should be affordable. Obviously, this is something, a real issue facing those of you in Wales. Housing should be accessible. It should be accessible to health services, to decent employment, and housing should be culturally relevant. It should protect you, of course, as well from inclement weather, etc. One of the things that doesn't get talked about with respect to housing as much as it should is how important it is for people who may experience a violation of the right to adequate housing, how important it is for that group of people, tending to be low-income people and other marginalized groups. It's very important that you be included in housing policies, programs, and legislation, that your experiences, your needs be included in the development of laws and policies. Obviously, housing affects so deeply everyone in their daily lives, and those who are most vulnerable need to be part of the equation. The other area of housing that isn't talked about as much as it should be, in my opinion, is access to justice. It's understood under international human rights law that you would have the ability to challenge a law, policy, or program or a decision made about your housing if you feel that it is a violation of your rights. And that's not always possible in every legal system around the world. And you can do your own assessment of whether you think you have an ability within your legal system to claim the right to adequate housing. But that is an essential element of having a human right. And the last thing I'll say about adequate housing and as a human right, and why I think it's so important and why I'm so very pleased to have been included in your conference, is that housing, in my experience, is often looked at really as a programmatic thing or a matter of policy. It's not always looked at as a human right or as an entitlement. And in my opinion, once you recognize that housing is a human right and an entitlement, it absolutely changes the way in which we devise policies, programs, and laws. And so I urge you in your own work and in your own thinking to always think about housing as a human right. It's not just a commodity. It may be a commodity in today's world, but it is not just a commodity. It is a human right, and that means that governments have obligations to uphold that right. So when they're drafting laws, policies, programs, governments need to be mindful of the fact that they're not just dealing with any old commodity. They're dealing with a human right. Some of you will know that my predecessor, Ms Rolnick, visited the United Kingdom on mission in September 2013. As I understand it, she wasn't able to visit Wales, but she did meet with government officials, civil society delegates, and with the Equality and Human Rights Commission of Wales. And she did receive written contributions beyond what she was able to discover on the ground in England. And as you may know, the process is, she visited your country and then had the official meetings with all of the stakeholders and then presented preliminary findings by way of a press conference. And many of you will know very well about the press conference and the fallout from that. And after that, she filed her report, presented it to the Human Rights Council, at which time the government of the UK was allowed to formally submit a response, which it did. And I would urge you to write to me and my colleague Juana for those documents if you don't have ready access to them, though I suspect that the organizers of the conference can also make those documents available to you. I found the report that Ms Rolnick filed to be excellent, covering a variety of issues in as much depth as possible in such a short report. And I also found the reply from your government very interesting and certainly would be useful to you in your work, I would imagine. Let me highlight for you, in case you don't have access to the report or you don't care to read such the long reports from the UN. They can seem somewhat dry and sometimes somewhat legal, although in this case I found it quite compelling. But let me just review for you some of the recommendations that Raquel Rolnick, my predecessor, provided to your government. And again, I think that they're very practical recommendations. They may not be as detailed as you may like in your domestic advocacy, but I think that they may be helpful as you move forward. The thing that she sort of put out there as an overarching concern is the principle of non-retrogression. So I start off with a very heavy legal recommendation, but it's so very, very important in your context. You see, the Special Rapporteur understood very, very well the long history in the UK of having a commitment to social housing and having a commitment to ensuring everyone had a decent place to live. Until about the 70s, 80s, and 90s, when there started to be some gross erosion of those principles. And even more recently, with certain welfare reforms and certain divestment of money in social housing, the erosion of that long history of commitment was of concern to the Special Rapporteur. And it's of concern because there is this principle in international human rights law of non-retrogression. That is, a government under any conditions, it doesn't even matter if it's, conditions of a global economic crisis or austerity measures, states are not allowed to engage in policies or programs or laws that would result in retrogression. In other words, that would set you back. So if as a result of laws or policies or programs you're seeing a decline in the number of available social housing units, if you're seeing an increase in homelessness, if you're seeing greater barriers to accessing private rental accommodation because of affordability issues, these are all things that point to the state having taken retrogressive measures, which is considered a violation under international human rights law. So that is a very, very serious allegation and a very serious concern by the Special Rapporteur, and one that you should think about. And really, this is an issue of holding your government accountable to a very particular legal obligation. Beyond that, Raquel made several suggestions that I'll reiterate for you. She requested the government that they evaluate the impact of the current welfare reforms, especially because her sense was from the testimony she received and the statistical evidence, etc., that the welfare reforms were obviously having a disproportionate impact on the poorest, because the poorest are those who rely on welfare, of course. And she made the recommendation that the policies be changed in light of the need to protect the most vulnerable, so that those policies need to be revamped so that they don't have a disparate impact on those who are most vulnerable or the poorest. She also suggested very clearly that the removal of the spare room subsidy should be suspended. She suggested that grants and subsidies be extended and expanded for social housing, and that with any new development, a variety of tenure forms be offered so that there would be home ownership as well as rental and perhaps cooperative arrangements as well, so that you're not just looking at locked into one type of form of tenure, because of course different forms of tenure meet different needs and different household needs. She also suggested a release of public lands upon which public housing could be developed. And with respect to the private rental sector, where, as I understand it, you're seeing more and more people being driven into the private rental sector, but there aren't proper protections for the lowest income people. So it makes it very difficult to access private rental accommodation. And as I understood it, the increase in homelessness is you're seeing in the UK is directly related to the lack of protections in the private rental market. And so she suggested a whole swath of protections that could be attached, such as making sure contracts for rental accommodation are longer than just 6 months or even 12 months, that people could enter into multi-year tenancies, and that there be a cap or restraint on rent increases. So that gives you an overview of what my predecessor has said about the conditions in the United Kingdom. I urge you to read the response of your government so that you know what their position is, or what their public position is in the on the international stage. You can compare that with their public position domestically, because sometimes those positions are different. But I think you'll find it useful and enlightening in your work. So there is always the issue of follow-up to a Special Rapporteur report. This is really where groups like yours and national human rights institutions come into play. It's very important that civil society take what the Special Rapporteurs have done and use it. I have had the experience of being able to use, in my own country context, Special Rapporteur reports in a variety of contexts, in advocacy, in litigation, as awareness raising, etc. So I really urge you to use what the Special Rapporteur has produced, to reproduce it, to produce it in a way that makes sense for your work. But that is the only way international human rights law has any traction or moves anything forward. Otherwise, it's just a report that is, sitting in the vaults of the United Nations or sitting on the shelves of government officials. So I urge you to view the Special Rapporteur's reports and recommendations as a tool, and one that you can manipulate and use for your own interests. I think in conclusion, I'd like to tell you a little bit about what I intend to do with the mandate of the Special Rapporteur, my mandate as a Housing Rapporteur. I'm in the early stages of formulating my mandate, of course, but there are a few areas that you may find interesting and you may find valuable in an ongoing way with your own housing situation. I will say at the outset that I am very concerned with the situation in the UK and in many other developed countries where we're seeing a divestment in social housing, a reliance on the private rental market without adequate protections, and where we're seeing sharp increases in homelessness. And I'm particularly concerned about these things when they arise in the context of affluence or a wealthy nation. The United Kingdom is a wealthy nation, for example, and when you're seeing this trend, especially a trend of increasing homelessness, it's of grave concern because a state is required to use the maximum of their available resources to ensure the full realization of the right to adequate housing. And so the question is, when you're dealing with a wealthy nation and you're seeing a rise in poverty or a rise in homelessness, it raises the live issue of, are the maximum available resources being used? What does that mean? And is the right being progressively realized? And so that will be of concern throughout my mandate, articulating what that means. What does progressive realization mean? What does the use of maximum available resources mean? And what does it mean in different contexts? What does it mean in the least developed country? And what does it mean in one of the most developed countries? I also will pay very close attention throughout the mandate to vulnerable groups. I have a long history working on women's housing rights, and I will maintain that commitment. But I will also focus on persons with disabilities, migrant workers, and Indigenous peoples. And of course, within those categories, I will look at women as well, because we know that women often bear the brunt of violations of housing rights. So that I have that commitment. I believe very much in an equality rights framework and a substantive equality rights framework. And so I will bring that to all of my work in the mandate, whether it's a mission, a thematic report, or a communication or a presentation. I also intend to focus on homelessness as a discrete area that's requiring further research and articulation from an international human rights perspective. I'm particularly concerned about the criminalization of people who are homeless, or the negative stereotyping of people based on their housing status. That could include, for example, social housing tenants and people living in poverty, and the relationship between that status and discrimination. I intend to do a thematic report on homelessness that will cover all of those areas. Other areas that may be of interest to you, I'm quite interested in what we call subnational government obligations around the right to adequate housing. In many countries, including your own, we're seeing a devolution of responsibility from the national government to local governments, and even sometimes local councils, sometimes social housing authorities. And so I'm quite interested in grappling with, well, what does that mean in terms of the realization and the implementation of the right to adequate housing, which is and remains the responsibility of the national government. What's happening in that interaction? How is the subnational government or the third party involved in housing, how are they ensuring that the right to adequate housing is being ensured for the people for whom they're providing housing? I think that sort of covers the bulk of what I intend to do. I should actually add, access to justice will be also a big area. I mentioned that at the beginning of my comments. The idea that everyone should have a remedy to a violation of a right, everyone should be able to claim their human rights. That's a lovely notion. I'd like to investigate how much that's actually happening on the ground, where that's happening, what are best practices, what are good models for access to justice for violations of the right to adequate housing. So I wish you the best of luck with your conference. Again, I appreciate so much being able to participate, even if only through video. And I do urge you to remain in close contact with me. I am happy to consult with you, to meet with you, and certainly to act in a more formal role. If there's communications that you care to send to the office, by all means, please consider doing so. We very much rely on civil society to provide us with information. Special rapporteurs are not, it's not a funded position. I have a staff of one, and she and I are both overworked, and so any assistance you can provide us would be much, much appreciated. Thanks so much.